Just another prairie is not just another prairie. Every single prairie is going to be somewhat different because of all the factors that have gone on for centuries and millennia, basically in terms of plant evolution, to develop what we see now as a prairie. This diagram here shows the three main factors on each of these sides of this three-dimensional box that are the most important factors that determine what a prairie looks like, what plant species are there. And of course, what plant species are there then determines what animal species are there. There's a linkage between that. So the plants, of course, provide the habitat. The first most important factor, not surprisingly, is soil moisture and fertility. How much soil moisture is available in the soil, how much water does the soil hold, how much nutrients are there, what's fertility level. That's along this first gradient that we see right here. The second important factor is along this gradient right here. I call it biogeography. And biogeography simply means that the species we find in a prairie, again, are going to be different depending upon where you are in Iowa, where your home is. Because most species, and this includes any kind of plant species, whether it's a wetland, forest, or prairie species, do not occur in every single county in the state. That's not the way they ended up after nature, brought prairie back to Iowa after the last glaciation. And for example, that past flower you see right there, that map right here shows the distribution of past flower. It only occurs in the northern half of Iowa. The reasons, well, we don't know exactly, but it depends upon where past flower evolved. It probably evolved in the northern Great Plains. And as it spread out from its place where it evolved, where the species became into existence many millions of years ago, it spread out from there, and it hasn't gone into southern Iowa. Now, it could be because maybe it doesn't like the climate after you get so far south. I mean, trying to figure out the whys that explain these maps is challenging. The important point is simply that almost every single plant species will have a map that looks something like that. Biogeography, where the plant has come to find its home, where it lives on the face of the earth, is another important factor that determines what you're going to find in a prairie. If you have a prairie down here in southern Iowa, for example, Tipton Prairie, you're not going to find past flowers out there. They've never been there. That's not where their biogeographical range is. Then the third factor here is what I call environmental perturbation. It's on this axis right here. These are things that can happen because of fire, things that can happen because of animals that are digging out there. We're going to talk about each of these a little bit more. But again, this is another third important factor that determines what plant species you could expect to find on a prairie. Basically, perturbation or disturbance is something that happens either, again, physically, by fire or flooding, or biotically, the organisms that live there, like badgers or bison, and what they do in that ecosystem to cause, you might say, sort of a disruption, to cause the death or the reduction of some of the vegetation. You can see that happening with fire. You can see that happening with the mound of soil that a badger piles up when it's digging a den or is going after some food. So let's look at that soil moisture gradient a little more closely, because this is, again, the most important thing. And what this is trying to show you is there's a gradient, meaning a gradual change from one end to another, from a very wet end, something called a wetland, where you've got standing water. That's going to be called a hydric soil because it's flooded, completely flooded. There's water standing at the site, a hydric soil. That's not a prairie, that's a wetland. But prairie starts right here with what we call a wet mesic tallgrass prairie. And as we get drier and drier and drier, we can get to a midgrass prairie at this far end on the right side. And this, again, is sort of a step-by-step process. There's going to be different species that occupy those different kinds of wetness, those different environments. Again, here in the wetland, those are bulrushes. Those are wetland species. But once we get into a wet prairie environment, and that's what this means, that's prairie cordgrass. That might be a dominant grass you would see. And then as it gets a little bit drier, mesic means medium moisture. It means damp, moist, but not too wet. Not too wet, not too dry. Mesic, perfect. So the perfect kind of moisture that most plants like. Here we see big blue stem. Here we see some prairie drop seed. Those are mesic tallgrass prairie species. Now we get into drier environments, and I'll show you some ways in which that's going to happen just a little bit here. We start picking up some species that like things drier. They're better adapted to dry soils, like porcupine grass, and then little blue stem, and finally Cytodes grama. So again, on this gradient, we see high soil moisture, high soil fertility down here, low soil moisture and fertility there. Now the things that are going to help create that gradient in the prairies are these things. In the red, you see climate. Climate varies across Iowa, I'm sure you know, from northwest Iowa to southeast Iowa by almost 10 inches of rain different in terms of the annual precipitation. Southeast Iowa can get near 40 inches of rain per year. Northwest Iowa can be around 30 or even 28. So a huge difference just in climate across our state, where again, high precipitation is going to create these kinds of environments, low precipitation, these kinds. The slope azimuth is the direction that a slope faces. So if the landscape's hilly, you've got hills out there, then there's always going to be a slope face, a slope azimuth, some direction that slope is facing towards the south, towards the west, whatever it may be. If a slope is facing north to northeast, that's going to make it more wet, because that's not going to get direct sunlight. In Iowa, where we are, of course, in the northern hemisphere, at 42 degrees north latitude, the sun is always going to be coming sort of from the southern sky onto our landscape. The sun is, at noon, the sun is never overhead in Iowa. It can't be. The sun is always off into the southern sky. And in June, it's going to be the furthest north that it can be, but it's still going to be in the southern part of the sky. And that always means then that north-facing or northeast-facing slopes are going to get less radiation, less heat, less evaporation. Whereas, again, a south or southwest-facing slope is going to get the brunt of that solar radiation. Now, if you're going to build a home, you might decide, well, do I want to get some free solar energy and build it on the south side of a hill so I get more solar radiation heating my home? Or do I want to have more of a cool spot? Do I want to be on the north side of the hill? Relative elevation, that's how high you are in the landscape relative to the landscape around you. So again, high relative elevation means you're up on tops of hills. Low relative elevation means you're down in the bottom portion of the landscape. Relative elevation is just where you are relative to the rest of the landscape. And obviously, moisture is always going to go from high relative elevation to low relative elevation. Gravity pulls moisture down to the low areas. And so again, low areas are going to have these kinds of prairies. High areas are going to have these kinds of prairies. And you can see this very easily at Tipton Prairie. You can see that happening as you walk from the creek across the creek, getting into Tipton Prairie. You're at the low part of the relative elevation scale there, and those grasses are going to be these tall grasses. Then you make your way up the hill to the top of the hill at Tipton Prairie. You're going to be walking up into a higher relative elevation, and you're going to see these grasses. That's one thing that makes Tipton Prairie so diverse, is that it's got that topographical change from a low elevation to a high. Soil texture. Fine texture like clays are going to be damp, more damp. They're going to hold moisture more. Water doesn't drain through that soil very well, versus coarse or sandy. Again, we see that at Tipton Prairie. Down in the low part of the landscape, the soils are more clayey, making it more damp. Up on top of that hill, you can see gravel, you can see sand, you can see where a badger's dug into the ground. There's going to be lots of coarse gravel and sand. That's going to be very porous. That means water's not going to stay there very well. It's going to move down through that soil. And finally, the amount of fertility, what's called the A horizon, or the topsoil. Just think of the A horizon as the topsoil. That's the most fertile part of the soil. That's where the organic matter is. So again, deep soils with lots of organic matter are going to produce these kinds of communities. Shallow soils, thin soils with less organic matter are going to produce these kinds of plant communities. So there's a whole spectrum of, again, really what kind of prairie you're looking at based upon those 5 factors.
How do you delineate between a wetland and, say, an ephemeral prairie pothole? Is it simply by plant community?
Usually vegetation is the best clue to what you should call that. Whether you're going to call it a wetland or you're going to call it a wet prairie. And obviously there'll be some, there are prairie species that can live in wetlands. There are wetland species that can live in a wet prairie. And so nature doesn't have, black and white lines that separate things. There's always a gray area, gradual change. So yeah, but we look at a list of the plants, see like a whole list of plants that we see, and there's a system actually for doing that where if it's known to be a wetland species, it gets a wetland index number that's negative, from a -1 to -5. If it's a upland, non-wetland species, it gets a positive number from 1 to 5. And so if you look at the list of those species, look at all of those wetland indices, add them up or get an average. If it's negative, the plants are telling you, yeah, this is a wetland. If it's positive, the plants are saying this is an upland. But if you're right at 0, then you're right on the line, right?
Depends on the year, yeah.
Right. Now I'm going to take a quick tour around Iowa to show you some really, again, neat prairie remnants. SP up there means state preserve. So state preserves are the most important natural pieces of landscape Iowa has left. They've been designated by the Iowa DNR and a proclamation by the governor to be made as a state preserve. It's a fairly rigorous, criteria basically that the DNR uses to determine if a site is worthy of being a state preserve. Because again, they are supposed to be the best examples of nature, of the natural world that Iowa once had, that we have left. And that's so important to make that rigorous. And again, keep that bar fairly high for that to happen. State preserves are not for people. You can visit them. You won't find any trails. You won't find any picnic tables. You won't find any shelters. They're not for us. State preserves are for the animals and plants that live there. Those are, again, our best examples. So Williams Prairie in Johnson County is a nice wet mesic prairie. Hayden Prairie, a 240-acre mesic prairie. Mesic, again, medium moisture prairie. In fact, I'm going to be leading a field trip for the Iowa Native Plant Society to Hayden Prairie on May 3rd. This is one of our, we consider to be one of our gems as far as prairies go in Iowa. It's named after Dr. Ada Hayden, who many of you know she was the first woman to get a PhD at Iowa State, and she worked at Iowa State as curator for the herbarium. And a lot of the work that Dr. Ada Hayden did in the early years when she was active at Iowa State, she did a lot of surveys of, again, what pieces of natural landscape there were left. And she wrote a report to the DNR that highly advised the DNR, these are some of the best prairies that we have left in the state, and advocated for their protection. So Hayden Prairie is named in her honor.
Is that in Story County?
Hayden Prairie is in Howard County.
Okay.
Yeah, the county is the second line down.
Excuse me. Thank you.
Just up in northeast Iowa. So it's a ways from here. Woodside Prairie, now that's interesting because that's privately owned. So far, most of these are owned by the state, these state preserves, of course, or county conservations. But Woodside Prairie is owned by a family. Ethel Woodside was the matriarch of the family, and she insisted that this 11-acre prairie never get plowed up. We'll talk more about how prairies survived the transformation that most of Iowa went through, of course, a little bit later. But again, because of her insistence, and now her heirs, it's her nephew that now is taking care of the land, following in her footsteps, of course. It's one of the best prairies in the state. It's not a preserve, hasn't gone through that, but it certainly could be. Sylvan Ronco State Preserve out in Monona County, that's the Lost Hills, that's where I grew up.